Civil Practice Group at the law firm of Jarvis, Krieger Sullivan. Also with us today are my partner, Elliot Krieger, one of our associates, Carl Trong, and our paralegal, Kate Pham, will be doing some translation for us. We've asked you here this morning to help us announce a filing of an action under the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organization Act, otherwise known as RICO. We filed that in the United States District Court, Central District, in the Southern Division here in Orange County. This directly affects the Vietnamese community in not only Orange County, but also Los Angeles County and the people of California as a whole. We provided case summaries for you and a full copy of the complaint, which is quite long. It's in the 30-page range. Tonight we're going to have comments from my partner, Elliot Krieger, who is a former federal prosecutor and a named partner in the firm. He'll take you through the salient facts and summarize the critical elements of the case. We'll also have some comments from the victim here, who was victimized by this organization, Mrs. MAI NGOC BUI. She's sitting at the table in front of me. Because of the nature of a RICO action, we're not going to be able to make or take any questions specific to the facts of the case. Everything that we would be able to talk about will be found in the complaint, but these types of cases are very sensitive, as you may know. We will have, after Mr. Krieger speaks, I'll have a couple of closing comments. We have a case number now that we could give you and so on, because the matter was just filed. I also want to thank you all for showing up. Here today we have Nguyen Vet Daily News, Bien Dong Daily News, Viet Phao Daily News, Saigon TV, Little Saigon Television, the OC Register, FreeVN.net, and Set TV. Thank you all for being here. Now, Elliot Krieger.
Thank you very much. As Mr. Spagnola just stated, a few hours ago we filed a complaint in the Federal District Court for the Central District of California, alleging that defendants Lan Nguyen, Hung Tran, Mimi Nguyen, Ton Nguyen, Vu Nguyen, and Tri Tran, and a company called Sky Investments LLC, jointly constitute a criminal enterprise described under the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, as an ongoing criminal enterprise which is involved in forgery, identity theft, fraud, bank fraud, and financial elder abuse to obtain the money of victims with the intent to defraud these victims. The complaint that we filed, which you should have in front of you, states that this case is about an ongoing criminal real estate investment racket operated in Orange and Los Angeles counties by those defendants since at least the early 2000s. The defendant's victim in this case is our client, Mrs. Bui, a 76-year-old retired woman who cannot read or write English, can barely understand and speak it. Mrs. Bui was of meager means, but won a share of her family's lottery ticket. Using classic big con manipulative techniques, the defendants plundered almost $4 million in cash from Mrs. Bui's bank accounts in the space of 11 months, from November 2012 to September 2013. This was the money that she got from the lottery. The complaint continues and states that the defendants accomplished this plunder of Mrs. Bui's $4 million of cash by means of deliberate, calculated, and malicious illegal acts, which included fraud, wire fraud, and forgery. But this was not the defendant's first adventure in real estate fraud. Prior to Mrs. Bui, the defendants claimed at least one other victim, who by the defendant's act of identity theft, forgery, and bank fraud, was damaged to almost $2 million. That illegal conduct did bring multiple counts of criminal charges against defendants Lan, Ton, and others by the Orange County District Attorney, That complaint, for unknown reasons, was dismissed, but it was dismissed without prejudice to refiling the charges. That criminal complaint is attached to the civil complaint that you should have in front of you. The defendant's illegal conduct is an ongoing and is alleged in the complaint to pose a continuing threat to the welfare of the general public unless ceased by judicial action. The way this big con started against Mrs. Bui was with a gentleman named Hong Tran. For more than 10 years, my client, Mrs. Bui, visited Hong Tran at his home, where he operates an unlicensed acupuncture practice. In spite of being unlicensed in the practice of medicine, Hong Tran routinely introduces himself and refers to himself as Dr. Tran. Plaintiff developed a relationship of complete trust and confidence with defendant Hong Tran, or who she knew as Dr. Tran. Around August of 2012, Mrs. Bui told Hong Tran that a member of her family won millions of dollars in a winning lottery ticket and that she would be receiving her share. Upon learning of Mrs. Bui's good fortune, Hong Tran wasted little time finding ways to access Mrs. Bui's money for himself. Hong Tran recognized that Mrs. Bui, because of her age, because of her inability to read English, her inability to understand what was in documents written in English that she was signing, and the fact that she was not receiving any assistance at that time in managing her financial affairs, that she was an easy mark. The first thing Hong Tran did was to convince the elderly Mrs. Bui to loan him $40,000 in cash for his alleged sick mother in Vietnam. Mrs. Bui kindly gave him the money. Around this time, in August and September of 2012, Hong Tran met with a LAN Nguyen and informed her of Mrs. Bui's fortune. Together, Hong Tran and LAN Nguyen contrived a scheme involving real estate acquisitions whereby they would gain Mrs. Bui's trust through simple real estate purchases and consequently get access to her bank accounts to loot for their own benefit. Because Mrs. Bui trusted Hong Tran implicitly as her doctor, she was also persuaded to put her trust in LAN Nguyen as her financial advisor. On October 19, 2012, Mrs. Bui received the first of her disbursements from her family in the amount of over $3.5 million, which went into her Wells Fargo checking account. At just that same time, Hong Tran and LAN Nguyen convinced Mrs. Bui to purchase a residential property for investment purposes at 225 North Figueroa in Santa Ana. This property was owned by LAN Nguyen's son, Ton Nguyen. They persuaded Mrs. Bui that this was a safe investment and that LAN Nguyen could manage and collect rent on the property for her. Then on October 31st, just a few days after she got the money, Mrs. Bui was driven by LAN Nguyen to an escrow office, signed the paperwork in English to close the purchase of the Santa Ana property, and she ultimately was conned into wiring $781,321 for this purchase. After this first real estate transaction, Hong Tran and LAN Nguyen furthered their scheme to defraud Mrs. Bui by convincing her to purchase a property in Huntington Beach this time. Upon that property, they were to build 3 homes in equal partnership with Hong Tran. Since Hong Tran did not have any money of his own, Hong Tran and LAN Nguyen persuaded Mrs. Bui to loan Hong his share of the purchase price. So this shared purchase, 50-50, was Mrs. Bui with her half and Hong Tran with his half, which was given to him by Mrs. Bui. Accordingly, Mrs. Bui and Hong Tran agreed that she would loan $1 million to Hong Tran. LAN Nguyen assisted in closing the transaction. To date, the construction of the 3 homes has not been completed, and Hong Tran has not repaid any principal. At this point, Mrs. Bui still had complete trust and confidence in the defendants Hong Tran and Lan Nguyen, such that in January 2013, Lan Nguyen persuaded Mrs. Bui to make another investment in Huntington Beach. Lan Nguyen drove Mrs. Bui to the corner of Olive and First in Huntington Beach and pointed out a vacant lot at 235 First Street. Lan Nguyen told Mrs. Bui the purchase price for that lot was $1.7 million. Lan Nguyen persuaded Mrs. Bui to lend Hong Tran another $500,000 so he could participate in the deal too. On February 23rd, Lan Nguyen drove Mrs. Bui to Wells Fargo to purchase a cashier's check for $1.7 million. And you'll see in front of you a copy of that cashier's check. This was from Mrs. Bui's Wells Fargo checking account. Lan Nguyen personally instructed the bank teller to make the check payable to, as you see up there, Sky Investment LLC, a company owned by Lan Nguyen's daughter, Mimi Nguyen. None of the $1.7 million, none of the $500,000 that she gave to Hong Tran was used to purchase the property in Huntington Beach. There was no property purchased. The money was wired and simply went away. Then in furtherance of the scheme, it was also discovered that on December 3rd, 2012, defendant Hung caused a wire transfer to be made of Mrs. Bui's money to an escrow company in the amount of over $171,000. We've learned that those funds were used by Tree Tran, apparently a relative of Hong Tran, to purchase a condominium residential property in West Hollywood. This property in West Hollywood is owned by another son of Lan Nguyen, Vu Nguyen. Mrs. Bui had no knowledge of this transaction. Mrs. Bui did not authorize this transaction, and further, she has no interest in the West Hollywood property. Over the course of 11 months, through various devices, such as the ones I just described, the defendants took $3.8 million from Mrs. Bui. You'll see behind me, and it's in the complaint, and it's very hard to read because it's very small, because the transactions are so $3,879,242.49. Defendants have refused to return the money. Defendants have refused to provide any paperwork. Lan Nguyen has admitted that with respect to Mrs. Bui's money, she lost it all. We're bringing 11 causes of action against the defendants. The plaintiff alleges that the purpose, scheme, and racketeering activity in which the criminal enterprise, this group of people and Sky Investments, is engaged in forgery, identity theft, fraud, bank fraud, financial elder abuse to obtain the money of victims with the intent to defraud the plaintiff and others in violation of the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. Mrs. Bui also alleges a serious charge of elder abuse. She is 76 years old, and defendants deliberately and wrongfully use their influence over her for their own gain and benefit. There is a claim for unfair and fraudulent business practices targeting a senior citizen. There are claims, as you can see, for breaches of fiduciary duty, breach of promissory notes, fraud, negligence, negligent misrepresentation, and a request for an accounting. We are hopeful through this press conference we can reach more victims. And anyone with more information regarding this case or been victimized by these people, please contact me or Mr. Spagnola at Jarvis, Krieger & Sullivan. Our contact information is on the pleadings that we have parked up here. And now Mrs. Bui would like to make a short statement herself.
Nhờ trời đất phù hộ nên tôi may mắn trúng số và được một số tiền lớn. Sau khi thầy Hùng biết tôi trúng số, thầy và bà Lam dụ dỗ tôi đầu tư với họ. Tôi nghe lời họ, nhưng không may cho tôi, họ gạt tôi và lấy cạn tiền trong nhà băng của tôi đến mấy triệu đô la. Cho dù tôi biết thầy Hùng gần 10 năm nay, không ngờ thầy Hùng lường gạt tôi, đối xử với tôi như vậy, lại ta rập cùng bà Lan nhẫn tâm gạt tiền của tôi và bảo bà ấy là một nhà đầu tư địa ốc giỏi. Nhưng khi nhận tiền của tôi xong thì nuốt mất sạch tiền của tôi và không đầu tư gì hết. Xin kêu gọi quý ngài giúp tôi tìm lại công lý. Tôi thành thật cảm ơn quý ngài.
My name is MAI NGOC BUI. I have never had much money in my life and had the fortune of sharing the lottery winnings with my family last year. After having learned of my good fortune, Dr. Tran and MAI NGUYEN persuaded me to invest with them. I went forward with the MAI NGUYEN and Dr. Tran's plan. To my dismay, they emptied my bank accounts and stole several million from me. I have known Dr. Tran for almost 10 years. I never thought he would do this to me. Now I find out that he's not even a doctor. I never thought MAI NGUYEN, who convinced me she was a savvy investor and a real estate expert, would steal my money. I would like to see justice rendered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bui. In closing, we have a case number. It's case 57. We have not been assigned a judge yet. That'll probably happen later this afternoon. We will be next door. If there's any other questions we can answer for you, we will not be able to answer any specific questions about the facts of the case, but we can talk about what a RICO action is generally. Thank you very much for coming again today.